because I mean, I am like for sure a workaholic, like self-diagnosed.
That's obvious. You're like the fastest responder to email that I've ever encountered.
Yeah.
Which I love, but
it's a problem. That's the worst part about working from home is the separation between work and home is very difficult. But at the same time, I always wanted to figure out options of like where do I want to be happy.
This is A New Angle, and I'm your host, Justin Angle, marketing professor at the University of Montana. This podcast is my chance to speak with cool people doing awesome things in and around the great state of Montana. We are proudly underwritten by First Security Bank and Blackfoot Communications. All right, welcome back. Thanks for tuning in this week. Today's episode, my conversation with Hank Donovan, the owner of Rattlesnake Cables, friend of the podcast, official cable provider of the podcast, and just a cool story. Cables are maybe something that you would overlook in music, the importance of cables, and Hank makes the case quite powerfully that they're actually super important, and it's cool to hear about his approach to that and the hustle it's taken to get Rattlesnake Cables off the ground. We also hear about his own music, prominent musician in his own right. His band Magpies plays all around the country, and check him out. So anyway, turn it over to Hank Donovan. Okay, so we're here today with Hank Donovan. Hank, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
So Hank, you're the owner, operator, all things Rattlesnake Cables. In fact, this is our first recording, our first interview with your new cables installed in the studio. That's
awesome.
Pretty awesome.
Yes.
And, I am sort of starting to learn the sound game a little bit, but maybe you can tell me how these cables should sound differently than our previous cables.
Well, I mean, when we're dealing with like XLRs, it's a little different, where there's a sound difference mostly goes with instrument cables. That's where you notice the sound for like guitar and bass cables.
Okay.
And it's all due with capacitance and how cables are designed and built. So that's where we try to get the best design cables possible to provide a good tone for musicians.
Okay. So we'll get into all of that today, but you've been kind of a long time contributor to the music scene here in Missoula and beyond. I'd love to talk about that. I mean, your band Magpie, I love your music, and just love to hear sort of the story about how you got into music. You started a little later in life and how it became such a big part of your life.
Yeah, I mean, I've been playing instruments, guitar, for a long time. I just never really quit. So like Magpies, that's like, I've been in Magpies for about 6 years now, but before that, I've been in all sorts of random little bands and projects. And, I got my first guitar when I was a senior in high school. So that's where it started.
Yeah. And where was high school?
I graduated high school in Flathead, so Kalispell.
Right on.
Yeah. So when I got into guitar, it was always on kind of the weird side of music. So punk rock, alternative, goth, post-punk, that whole thing where, there was hardly anybody that was really into it. Each little school back in Montana back then had 5, 6, 10 people that were...
I mean, how did you even find this world?
Well, I think where it started for me was freestyle bike riding. So like skateboarding and freestyling. That was my gateway.
Sure.
Into that. So
like BMX bikes on the half pipe, that kind of deal?
Yeah, I was all about flatland though. So like the flatland, tricks on the ground. Never was into the ramps too much.
Walking over the pegs and the tail whips and all
tail
that
whips,
stuff.
Yep, all
I've
that
taken
stuff.
many a good wipeout trying to pretend I was good at that.
Yeah, it's super fun, and every once in a while, I still have my Haro Master.
Nice.
And I'll pull that out.
What's that thing called? The rotor, where you could spin the bike and
the gyro.
The gyro, right?
Yeah.
Like you could spin the bike independently of the brake cables, right?
Yep, the Odyssey gyro.
That thing was awesome.
So at that time, I wasn't playing guitar or anything, and I was pretty much into like metal, just or hard rock.
Yeah.
And then
like AC/DC, that sort of
Van
stuff.
Halen, Def Leppard,
Big hair.
big hair.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was the '80s, and I got into freestyling and into the skateboard world, and that's where that hard rock started going into punk.
Yep,
and
a little edgier.
Yeah, and then that explodes into all sorts of genres of different music. So I was like listening to Exploited and Misfits, but I was also listening to The Cure and Jesus and Mary Chain. So those are complete sides of the spectrum there.
And it's harder to get your hands on that music in those days, right? I mean, you got to go sort through. You're probably having to drive a little bit outside of Flathead Valley to find find those cassette tapes.
Yeah, totally. The thing about those days, I always think it's funny, is any of the weird music was in imports. You had to go find the import section.
Yeah.
And it didn't matter. Like it wasn't imported. It was just the tape store didn't even know where to put it. So they're like, we'll just put it imported. It's that weird music. So I mean, every time we'd go to Helena or Missoula or something, we would go to Rock and Rudy's, but you'd go to Great Falls, you'd find some music store, and then go to the import section, and I would literally just close my eyes and just grab a tape, and then check it out. And it was always like, that's the first time I ever listened to Sonic Youth. Was doing it that way. I remember Agent Orange, I discovered that way, and Big Black. All of those things were, just random, like, pre-internet. So to even understand what a band is or who they are, or what they look like, or what's their discography, is like a ton of work.
Yeah.
And
labor of love. Like you had to earn it.
Yeah. And then the idea of like crowdsourcing that knowledge was a big deal. So it's like, if you got a tape, and I thought it was awesome, I might find another album of that same artist. I'd make you a tape of it, and and suddenly we'd learn more about it together. Someone would go to Seattle for a trip, and they would come back with stuff, and you'd be like, oh man, it's like, this is awesome. But yeah, it was a lot harder to get into that. And then years later, I moved to Missoula, and pretty much since I moved here in '93. And pretty much since that time, I was doing some kind of music thing, either a solo acoustic kind of thing. I don't want to say singer-songwriter because it wasn't like that, but it was on the weird side of it.
Okay.
To various.
You might have to unpack that for us there. That's a little bit of a breadcrumb we gotta lean into.
Well, we'll see. But yeah, and then just throughout the years, I would go in bands and out of bands and trying to figure out. There was a brief stint where I owned a recording studio.
Okay.
And I was just always wanted to be part of some kind of musical thing, whatever it is.
Sure.
Even the cable game, I just remember when I started that, I was kind of in between bands, as before Magpies, and I had this weird vision of being like this old dude with crazy like gray hair, and like musicians would come over and I'd fix their pedals, and like, you know what I mean? Like it was just like kind of this, I still wanted to be a part of it, even though I was like too old to be part of it, and I couldn't play anymore because my hands are all arthritic, but I still wanted to be part of the scene somehow.
I get it. Yeah.
So that was one of the things where it's like, making pedals or cables was a possibility. But then Magpies fired up, and then I got into that band, and that's been kind of just a awesome ride.
6 years, and you guys kind of tour regionally. Is that?
Yeah, the band themselves, they've been together for over 10 years. So I just signed on 6 years ago. But yeah, we tour. We've gone all the way to Chicago and Cleveland, down to San Francisco, Seattle a lot. Mm-hmm. A lot of Midwest stuff. We just came back from Denver last month.
How would you describe your music, your genre?
I mean,
although is that kind of like the question you never ask a musician is what category do you belong in? I mean, that's
but I mean, you have to.
Yeah, I think so.
Everyone needs to know what you sound like to even just have some kind of visual what box to put you in, But the classic big box, we just say indie rock.
Yep.
So, it's just a couple loud guitars, but we get compared to like Sonic Youth all the time, or Yola Tango.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I get it, sometimes I don't, but yeah, at least I don't have a problem with, at least I like Sonic Youth, and I wouldn't be like, oh man.
Yeah, exactly.
That band.
It's not a bummer.
Yeah. But we have two guitars. It's just loud, ruckusy. We definitely have melodies. There's two vocalists, husband and wife are the two singers. So it's great hearing their melodies and what they work with, and my guitar, I always try to counter with Tolan's guitar as far as we're just not playing the same thing. So I feel like there's a lot of movement in the stuff, even though it's like driving, but there's things that are happening.
Nice.
You know?
Yeah. Well, I love it. I've listened to a bit of it to kind of just gear up on getting to know your work a little bit more. And you know, I love the work of Magpies. It's really compelling. Takes me back to some of I mean, it's pretty clear I know nothing about music, but I like it. I like listening to it and sort of connecting it to some of the bands of my upbringing, the Sonic Youth and stuff like that. It's definitely a connection.
It's definitely 90s. And
exactly.
That's
it's
both
formative.
Tolan and I are both similar in age, so we both grew up in that time. So it's like, it's what I call the roots rock. Like, you know, immediately when I start playing guitar, it just sounds like the 90s.
Sure.
I don't try. I don't think about it. That's
your wheelhouse.
That's the stuff that, you know, it's in my DNA now, you know,
So let's continue on with this portfolio of hats that you wear. You know, you've got the Magpies, you've got Rattlesnake Cables, which we'll get into, but you've also got these various other pursuits. I mean, you do web development work, and you've got Effects Bay, Pedal Finder. Like, it seems like there's all these things you've been doing to kind of stay engaged in the musical space and make contributions wherever you can.
I have another business called Astarna, which is the web development business. So in 2003, I kind of went out on my own. I was working for a variety of firms in the early 2000s, web development. And then 2003, decided to go on my own. So I was just kind of working in my basement since then, working on, you know, small business websites, you know, band sites, personal websites, all sorts of stuff to keep me busy.
Drum Coffee website,
Drum
right?
Coffee.
Friend of the pod. You're sipping some Drum Peru blend right now.
Totally.
Official coffee of the podcast. Sorry, I had to slot that in there.
It's so good.
It is good. Thank you for that endorsement.
And so ever since 2003, like, the idea of being an entrepreneur that seed was dropped, and the idea of possibly making something work on my own terms was a thing.
Yeah.
I always thought it would be cool, like it was a possibility in just like my brain. But I mean, every job I had a boss. I worked in places, that whole thing. But until 2003, and then, you know, a few years later, I suddenly said, wow, I think I can do this, even though it's been a few years. Clearly, I'm doing it.
So you're attracted to the notion of, you know, owning your own time and being your own boss?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Because, I mean, I am, like, for sure a workaholic, like, self-diagnosed.
That's obvious. You're like the fastest responder to email that I've ever encountered.
Yeah.
Which I love, but
it's a problem. That's the worst part about working from home, is the separation between work and home is very difficult. But at the same time, I always wanted to figure out options of, like, where do I want to be happy? Mm-hmm. Web development is something I really enjoy. I love working on computers. The challenge, the logic of all that stuff's like really, really appealing. But music was the thing, and I was always trying to figure out how can I bridge the gap to, like, I don't think I can be a professional musician. I don't want to be on tour, you know, 9 months out of the year. That doesn't sound very cool.
Tough for the wife and family too.
You know, so all that's really tough. But then it was like, okay, maybe we can do these little passion side project businesses. And Effects Bay was the first thing that really came out of that, where I just wanted to have a blog that talked about guitar effects. And it just suddenly exploded into this community, it's been great. And it was super surprising and fun. And I've done there's like almost 3,000 posts for that thing. It just, the consistency thing was a challenge that I wanted to see if I could take. As a web developer, I always would get, you know, a business, they would say, oh, we need to have a blog. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yep.
And he'd be like, but, you know, I would just look at that business and go, okay, you're going to do it for like a month.
Yeah.
And then you're going to do it like every 3 months. And then it's like once a year. And then it's like never. And I'm going to go back to your website, and the last blog entry would be 6 years ago. Right?
Yep. This thing that you think is going to make you look good will start making you look bad.
It's the opposite, right? So I used to always say, like, you know, you have to think when you do a blog, you have to ask yourself, okay, how many can I do consistently from this point on until the day I die? Think of it that way instead of the window of like, what can I do today? This month, how many can I do this month?
You're scaring me. I'm thinking about this podcast. How am I going to keep it going?
You know, it's like, I mean, but that's where you get the realistic thing where it's like, okay, well, maybe I can do two a month. Well, then, okay, then do 2 a month until you die.
Yeah.
And then just keep going. So Effects Bay was one that I was like, okay, I'm going to sit there and like, I'm going to say, I'm going to do X amount, a month and just keep cranking it out. And then that's what I ended up doing for songs, how I got so many posts up there.
Yep.
And, for the first, while, you didn't get any kind of return on it. And you'd be like, why am I doing this? And then you start doing it. And then probably like this podcast, you eventually get the community that kind of depends on the content that you're putting out. Like that's part of their thing. Like I want to get my cup of coffee and read a post, or I'm waiting for that next episode of New Angle so I can, drink my coffee and see what's going on.
And with Effects Bay, like, and I don't purport to know music enough to really understand this, but it sounds, my sense is from looking at that site is that you're solving people's problems. Like people are sort of coming there. It's like a combination of advice, Pinterest, I want to do this with my kit. Effects Bay will there'll be something on there that'll help me replicate what, this band is doing or that musician's doing, or, help me approximate somebody else's setup that I find interesting.
Yeah. I mean, the idea, it's like, I don't think of it like, the way I would always talk about Effects Bay was like, I'm an aggregator of like content or ideas or something. I don't really like to be like an expert and where I'm saying, hey, this is, here's 10 ways that I do this thing to help you do that thing.
Yeah.
But I do love the idea of like trying to find things that might inspire people that I find. That's the aggregation part of it. Like I might find Jay Mascis from Dinosaur Jr.'s pedal board, and I break down all the pedals on it and I post all about it. So if you love Dinosaur Jr. and you want Jay's sound, you can sit there and say, oh, these are the pedals you have. And now you can start saying like, well, if I maybe got this pedal, maybe I can get that one tone that I was trying to get for this lead or something like that. With effects, it's one of those things you're never isolated to exactly what that effect is for. So you can get an Ibanez Tube Screamer, which is like a classic rock blues overdrive. But you can have like a noise band use it. You can have like a punk rock band use it, a country chicken picker with Telecaster doing country licks with the Tube Screamer. There's all these different applications. It doesn't necessarily mean, okay, you have this pedal, that's how you're going to sound. So there's always these like interesting little pockets of like this weird noise band, and they're using this strange pedal that like you would never expect a noise band to use, or a country person using a metal pedal. And you'd be like, oh, that's the whole creative inspiration part. Like, man, maybe I should get this weird pedal and just see how I can make it fit in my band or my style. And because usually a guitarist, especially, they have this weird problem. They want to sound completely different, yet they also want to sound exactly like someone else.
Yeah.
So somewhere in between, in that fuzzy, like kind of confusing state, you hopefully will come out with your own sound. Because you might be inspired of this band or this artist, and you start going down that path for that tone, but then your style is different, and then you start modifying it, and suddenly now you don't sound like that guy, but you sound more like you.
Okay.
So it's always a struggle. Like, I want to sound just like Jimi Hendrix, but do you?
But different. Yeah.
But different. I want to be the new Jimi Hendrix.
Well, and that might, I don't want to get too kind of off the thread here, but as you're learning guitar or any instrument, you sort of have, your first step is to like, want to learn how to play a song. And you probably choose, a song that's easy, but you also start to choose songs that are the songs you like. You play like your heroes. You see that with guitar, you see that with sports, you see it with whatever, but then you get to a point with certain proficiency where you start to have your own ideas, start to express yourself, but it's still somewhat derivative and influenced by others. And yeah,
there's always a point where I catch myself all the time where I'll like play this song, come up with a little riff, and I'm like, oh, this is awesome. And then I find out, oh my God, this is a totally a song from The Cure, from blah blah. It's like I just subconsciously,
Yeah.
Might be in a different key, but it's the same pattern. It's
thing.
the same, tempo, and everything about it's basically the same. And then you have to sit there and say, well, if I modify it, will it be my own, or is it, or can that just be the little tip of the cap to like a band that I like? No one else will even notice it, in the whole mix of everything, But as an artist, I always think that's the point where you have to get, is where when you start writing, you just subconsciously, naturally, just write your own sound.
A New Angle is underwritten by First Security Bank and Blackfoot Communications, two cool companies doing awesome things all over Montana.
Hey, this is Colter Nuanez from ESPN Missoula, and you're listening to A New Angle.
And that's hard. And then when you do it, it's easy. You know what I mean? Like, it's hard to get to that point, and then when you cross the threshold, suddenly that's the only way I can write. When I write music, for me, it's my song, my style for the most part, and my influences are wrapped around in it, and it just kind of plops out.
Right. Yeah. It's an interesting analogy, or just sort of way of thinking about it. We've interviewed a few different writers here on the show. We've interviewed a few different musicians, and I'm always interested in that's one of the big themes, is creativity and how it kind of comes to life, and that process. The only thing I can really equate it to, kind of as an academic, you spend your whole life as a student, right? And as a student, you get really good at answering questions. And then there's this moment where all of a sudden you're expected to start asking the questions. And like, that is a big challenge, like this level of ambiguity, like, whoa, I'm not used to doing it that way. And then once you figure out that you can ask questions, you all of a sudden realize, like, whoa, the amount of questions that are out there is infinite. There's way more questions to be asked than there are that have answers. So maybe something similar.
I think that's really similar.
Yeah.
I like that, because it is definitely it's a shift in thinking when you cross the threshold. It's just a different way of going about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes sense. So the one thing about Effects Bay and Pedal Finder, like, you're providing a service to a community, and it seems to me that that's a little bit of how Rattlesnake Cables kind of came to fruition. You started making cables for yourself, for your friends, and now it's a real thing. But let's take it back to those formative years. What was kind of the unmet need that you saw in the marketplace? Why was there a need for a better cable?
Well, I think it's let me think about like how to phrase that. So when you think about a cable, it's one of those items that are never really looked at as like a fun thing. It's never looked at as a cool thing or an exciting thing, right?
Yeah.
So you might spend $2,000 on a guitar, and you might spend $2,000, $3,000 on an amp setup, and then you go and get like the free cable that comes with it. I would say if you weren't aware about like what tone is going through between the guitar and the amp, that you could be almost in that whole thing of like your head's in the sand about it, because you might not know, and that's fine. So
if you're new, you're probably just aspiring to like, I'm saving all my pennies for that guitar, and once I get that, I get the amp, and the cable is like this extra thing. You're like, oh, well, whatever, just connect these two damn things and play.
Exactly. So the first thing a novice player would do or notice is the durability of the cable. Because you're going to notice that cheap cable breaks in 6 weeks, and then you're going to go get another cheap cable because you have no idea that actually impacts tone. You just think, I have this cable that connects these two devices. That cable broke. I need to get a replacement.
Sure.
So then the next logical step is, okay, I need to get a better cable that's more durable, so it lasts a little longer, right? So as you start climbing up the ladder of cabling, that's when you start getting to the point of the Rattlesnake level of like a boutique cable. So it's all about durability, for one. Then the surprising thing for a lot of people is the tone factor.
Yeah. So explain that.
Yeah. So when you get a cheap cable, that means the copper inside of the cable is usually a really, really thin thread of copper. It's shielded with like real thin, loosely wrapped shielding of copper, because the copper is the expensive part of the cable.
Yeah, copper's expensive.
Right?
I mean, that's why meth heads are ripping it off of gutters and
That's right.
stuff like that.
So
There's other reasons it's expensive too.
Yeah. So that little thread of copper can break and lose its connection. So that has that problem. And then the really loose shielding on it is where you start getting radio frequencies, RF. That's where you start, like the Spinal Tap, where you're starting to get, like you can literally get radio coming through your amp and stuff. It could be poor shielding on that. And the big part of the tone is what they call capacitance, where it's the physics between the center conductor and the distance between the outer shield. There'll be little electrons trying to pull off frequency from your center conductor going to ground. And what ends up happening there is you turn your cable into a capacitor, which is the same thing as a tone knob on your guitar. So what happens is you're going to have a darker, muddier tone.
Okay.
And weaker tone, right? So you can make those adjustments on your amp to dial stuff in, like, make it a little louder, add a little more high end. You can try to compensate for that. So what usually happens is, like, someone who's like in their whole entire musical world never ever cared about cables, and they'll get a Rattlesnake, they'll plug it in, and they'll email me, call me, whatever. They're like, whoa, it's like way louder, and it's like the highs are really crisp, and the lows are super punchy.
They're getting all of it.
Like they were so surprised it would actually literally change the tone of their guitar. And some people even were like, I had to change my amp because like I had all these highs in there. Now it's too high. And I'm like, I go, it kind of like brings it back to an even frequency baseline.
It's like you clean out the filter in your shower. All of a sudden, it's like all the water's coming through.
Yeah. So I like the idea of like, let's start with the best tone possible. Like your guitar going into a cable, into an amp should be your purest, simplest, positive tone. So before you add pedals and distortion and all sorts of craziness, you should just have a really good setup from like strumming the guitar and what's coming out of the amp. And that cable is a big part of that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I've listened to you, along those lines, I've listened to you talk about, as a web developer, you're working in your basement, you're earning your own time, you're building people's websites, you're a facilitator in that sense. There's some similarities. But I've heard you say there's an appeal to making things.
Oh, yeah. I kind of forgot about that until you just said that. So, when I started getting into computers in the late, 90s, I was fascinated by programming and the whole thing with websites. And then the idea of, pretty early on in the early 2000s, 2006, 2007 is kind of the point where I was kind of bummed out that everything I was making was all just stored on a computer.
Virtual.
Hard drive goes out, you lost it.
Sure.
Stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it was really kind of...
Well, and is it real, right?
Yeah. And around that same time, I started hanging out with a couple of luthiers and friends of mine, like online, and talking about what they're doing in the music field. And I was like, man, like, you guys make things, like physical things. Like, you could die and this thing stays around for, 100 years. Mm-hmm. You can pass this down to your children. Not saying that one day someone will pass like a guitar cable down to their grandkids, you know what I mean? But the idea of making something physical and seeing it used is like really amazing. When I go play a show and I use, my cable, obviously,
mm-hmm.
like everyone at Magpies, like, use them. It doesn't really do a whole lot for me, but it's like when I go to a show and it's like, I don't even know that band. I don't even know that person playing. And I look at their cable and go, hey, that's a Rattlesnake.
Yeah.
I don't know how they got that. I don't even know who that person is. And that's where you go, wow, it's like, there's also this weird trust thing too. Like, they're trusting this cable for this performance to work. You know what I mean? And so that's the other thing too, where it's like, I'm a part of helping them create their thing, even though it's like, I don't need any credit or anything.
No,
like
but
the idea is like,
you're a contributor in a way.
We're seeing that happen. And it's like, wow, it's like, that's cool. I don't get that kind of feeling when I do a website. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't care if it's like the most popular website in the world and there's tons of visitors, and I don't get that same like.
Interesting. I wonder what's different about that.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, there's something about like working with your hands and putting something together, though.
Well, so that making,
yeah,
and that's a whole thing in education right now. We're sort of getting into this whole makers and creating space for makers, and what we do with the Broader Impacts Group is get people out there, doing stuff with their hands, making actual things. And it makes me think about, we've talked offline about this cooking analogy.
Yeah,
right. You've got deep experience in the cooking space and have brought kind of the perspective that you learned in that space to your production of cables. You maybe talk about that.
Yeah. So it's like, when I graduated high school, all I focused on was finding music. I mean, that was a full-time job for me to like save all my money and order a tape in the mail or to go find a record store or whatever. And somehow maybe start this band that was in my head that was never, ever going to happen. That was all I cared about, and probably beer, right? That was it. And
it's good things to care about.
Yeah. We're talking, 19, right?
Sure.
So by the time, it was like 20, 21, the first kind of occupation that I got into that was like something that seemed like a career was cooking. So I got a job in a restaurant as a dishwasher and ended up getting on to be a cook and working with these line cooks that were, salty, like
grizzled vets,
grizzled, like burnt out cooks, like angry people with knives. And somehow I looked up to these people like, man, you guys got it all figured out, man. One day I'm going to be just like you.
You'll be angry and maybe have a knife too.
But I really loved working in a restaurant. And then when I moved to Missoula, there was this great Italian restaurant called Zimmerina's back then on like North Higgins. Awesome place. And working with a crew of cooks on a Friday night, full house, full board, there was always this really great camaraderie. And there was this, when you got the A team together and somehow you just felt invincible to crush a night. And then when it was all done, you got off and you had a beer. That was a thing where I was like, I thought was so awesome. But how that relates to cables is I noticed as soon as Rattlesnake got to the point where we were like doing production, like now I need to, instead of making like 2 or 3 cables a month, now we're making, 300 cables a month, right?
Sure.
It was a point where, okay, when there needs to be a process, like how does this process work? Like when an order comes in, like how does that go? And how does it work its way through the whole shop, right? That's where the cooking thing comes in. Suddenly now it's weird. Like tickets come in just like tickets in a restaurant and have a line, like a board. And we have prep cooks. That's the only way I can kind of quantify it in my head. So it's like prep cook, and there's like a saute cook is the guy doing the soldering.
Yep.
And, and it has this whole kind of flow where every time I'm even talking about how we do orders, there is a thing. I even applied that for web development a lot of times. Like when you work for a restaurant and you're an expediter, the one running the wheel, or the ticket board, or whatever you call it. In Zimmerino's, we call it the QB.
QB, what's QB stand for?
The quarterback.
Quarterback.
Yeah. We had quarterback, sauteer, and sluffer. Those are the 3.
Sluffer.
Yeah, sluffer was garlic bread guy, salad,
Utility player.
Utility, yep. And so when you're the QB, you used to have this board, and like to be an all-star on the board is how you manage the board. So if you got like a 10 top and you got 3 2 tops behind it, I used to pound out the 3 2 tops first. And normally people that are just new, they would just go sequentially. Like you do the 10 top, and the next one, and the next one. But it's like you're slow. The 10 top will always be slow. And you look like a hero if you pound out the 3 2-tops. The servers are going to love you. The 2-tops didn't have to wait till 10-top got their food. 10-top already knows they're going to be here for a while.
They're a big group.
They're all hanging out anyway, right? So it's like I do that with orders, So let me get like, I always refer to like single orders as being 2-tops. Like, oh, this is a 2-top order. And, we shuffle those around. And we just really super efficiently pound out a lot of orders that way. Instead of like, if a dealer order comes in, for instance, say, dealer order comes in, there's 80 cables on it. I'm not going to make those 80 and then make every custom order behind it wait an extra day. Because I'm kind of a fanatic about getting those things out. Right?
No loose ends.
Yeah. And, with the restaurant, another comparison with the cables is the fact that, every... you're as good as your last meal.
Sure.
You're as good as your last order, too, right? So it's like every time I send a cable out and an order, it's like a mini salesman, and I'm really strong about have strong feelings about buyer experience. Right?
Oh yeah, that's clear. I mean, the whole presentation, the branding, just the package you brought over for us. Like, we're looking at this little Rattlesnake Cables bag that in which the cables came. It's all just beautifully kind of choreographed for that user experience.
Yeah. I mean, the restaurant, Bob Zimmerman used to say, you eat with your eyes first.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
So it's like, I want people to feel like they're getting the best cable before they even plugged it in.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I want them to feel like they got the best cable when they just placed order. And like every step of the way, I want to reinforce that you did a good decision. This is going to be good. This is going to be great. And then open the box. I still want to keep giving you that feeling like we're good. This is good. Just wait till you plug it in.
It makes me think about that actual aspect of the relationship with the cable, the plugging in of the cable. And if that is maybe an interesting touch point where a musician can kind of experience this value, because you framed it in terms of like, hey, here's this thing that people sort of ignored in the value chain. You got your guitar, you got your amp. This cable was largely ignored. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, it's like there's really pragmatic and grounded ways that actually is critical in creating the sound, but the plugging in of it is the thing that kind of makes it all come to life. And I just wonder if that's part of the part of the experience.
Everyone has their like rituals, Sure. Like for me, I play with 2 guitars, and I have this like weird thing where I have 2 cables for both guitars, and I plug the same one in both of them. I have no idea why. They're the same length. I built them the same day, but if for whatever reason this one goes in this guitar and this one goes in that guitar, it's just my thing. It's like
ritual's important.
It's just part of it.
And if you can develop products that become part of a ritual, I mean, now you're developing brand identification.
Yeah.
It's becoming part of somebody's identity. It's becoming part of their routine. Those are powerful effects.
Yeah, I mean, the brand thing is like it's something that I've always thought was challenging and super fun at the same time. Where like you saw like on Instagram, like the rattlesnake sightings.
Which is an awesome, by the way, folks. It's an awesome hashtag to follow, rattlesnake sighting.
So that's one of those things where it's like I was trying to figure out like, okay, when we started selling beyond our friend circle, beyond our Missoula circle, like how do I even talk? Because when you're talking about cables, there's tons of people who make cables. Mm-hmm. I mean, in music gear, it's saturated in every aspect of it. You want to do pedals, you want to do guitars. There's a million guys doing all sorts of stuff. So it's like, how do you kind of cut through the noise? How do you work your way to like some kind of level of like people start taking notice of you?
Sure.
And it's a constant like fight, and the brand thing with Instagram and Facebook and all that stuff, it's always about like that community. I want that community around it, where I want people who own a cable to feel like they own a part of the brand. Like they're committed to it as well.
Sure.
Because they're the ones that are going to like, help spread the word. They're the ones going to tell their bandmate about it. And it's like, you want them to feel like they're part of this together. Because it's a weird thing where it's, if you just look at the brand, look at the product, it has to be more than that. It's where it's like the story, you're buying a piece of me too, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like people are into the idea of like, hey, this is Montana made. This is, this guy's like doing, taking these pictures and all sorts. That's all part of the thing. And that rattlesnake sighting was just another way of like, how can we get to the point where if you were on the fence or didn't even know about rattlesnake, I want you to I want that almost that weird feeling like I feel like I should want one, like in this weird way of like,
Yeah, no.
I don't know what it is, but I feel like I need one.
I felt that.
That's the thing where
I mean, you started following us on, I think it was after we dropped our episode with Jeff Ament. You started following the podcast, and I started following your social media and seeing these rattlesnake sightings. And I'm not a musician. I have no need for cables. I mean, we sort of have need here in the studio now. But I was like, man, these cables are cool. I want to get one of those cables. And then I got colleagues that are musicians and fans of your work, and they got rattlesnake mugs and rattlesnake this and that. Wow, this guy's built a lifestyle brand around cables.
Yeah,
It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, it's fun. That also goes, I think, also to I just remember Charlie's Beaton's episode, because he and I both have like a similar thread as far as like early old school punk rock ethics, or not ethics, but just the DIY aspect of like you have to do it yourself. And back in the days with the freestyle and skateboarding, we used to do like freestyling exhibition shows, and we had to do all our own posters and stickers. And the whole thing. So like we're trying to figure out ways of like, how can you make punk rocky attitude with like cables? Like how can like I'm just trying to figure out like how to spread the word in a non-conventional way. Because you'll see like big like huge like cable companies, and it's very like Premier Guitar Magazine slick. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
that's not really
polish.
Who we are. So it's like I was like, how do I get like more to guys that are like touring and or like musicians that are just looking for a different item, like not mainstream. Because I always feel like I'm always on the fringe of like weird music, or like I play different style of music. I like to have weird pedals. I like to like have different amps than like everyone else does. It's like you're always kind of just searching for something different. That was that whole thing where you want to sound like someone, but also
Exactly.
It's like it's kind of cool when you have like gear that no one else has too, and you'd be like, "Where'd you get that? What's that cable?" But it's just weird. It just comes back to like those like late 80s, early 90s. Just kind of like you had to really, if you wanted to do it, you just have to do it and just work at it and grind forever.
Well, gosh, I mean, as we're talking about this, so many kind of parallels to various areas of my profession kind of come in. I mean, and I think there's a lot of truth to the notion that at institutions, a lot of the most impactful work happens sort of on the fringes, right? Because maybe those are the areas that are overlooked, or not maybe as directly overseen, or maybe have the fewer resources and have to be crafty and resourceful. And just makes me think that there's something in this creative process about tension between scarcity and abundance. Sure, you give a team a bunch of resources and they can go make something, but you also like try to create some abundance of thought within an environment of scarcity, and interesting things might happen. Like you add some constraints, and you can kind of uncover some things you might not have ordinarily uncovered.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what's next for Rattlesnake Cables?
Man, just growing. We're always trying to improve over the year before, and we have, and it's been great to like kind of snowball when you look. I mean, my wife, who's a major part of Rattlesnake. I mean, she solders cables, and she's is a major pusher. Like for me, I'm like a guy like I kind of live in the grind, and I can put myself in a bubble of just killing myself basically, just going through it. And she has this view of what's next and what's further. Like she definitely pushes me out.
See the whole board.
Yeah, I always want to feel like I do, but I don't think I do.
Yeah.
She definitely does, and she'll be like, "Yeah, we should like do this," and I'm like, "Oh, we can't do that. That's too hard. That's too big of a bite. And next thing you know, we're doing it. And it's like and she always says it. I say no, and then it's like a week later, I'm like, I think that is a good idea.
A good idea.
It's like So, when I'm always thinking about the future, it's always about like, how can we, continually grow the brand? How can we increase our reach? Cables are kind of a weird product because, when you buy X amount, you're kind of done.
Yeah, when you buy cables that are particularly durable, too, right?
Yeah. So it's like,
you got to grow your market. You're all about new customers.
Yeah. But, it's weird though. It's, I'm a firm believer of that whole 80-20 rule, so it's like in the world of my world, that's a huge, huge thing. So even though my existing customers might be dead as far as like new purchases, they never are. It's strange because they're the ones buying gifts.
Yeah, that word of mouth effect too,
and
sharing and being part of the tribe. I mean, those sorts of effects are powerful for you guys.
So, I think we're just going to continue on that. We do have some new products. We're going to be working on a coily guitar cable here soon.
Okay.
And getting in further into our dealer market, try to do that. But definitely, our focus has always been like custom work for people and and just trying to get to, more bands and more musicians.
In the hands of the people.
In the hands of the people.
So Hank, how can you listeners find Rattlesnake Cables and find your work?
Well, you can go to www.rattlesnakecables.com for the website. And if you want to see examples, I would go to instagram.com/rattlesnakecables or facebook.com/rattlesnakecables.
Yeah, follow that hashtag, rattlesnake sniting.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks, Hank, for coming down, sharing your wisdom, your story, and for contributing to the podcast. It's just great to have you guys as part of the family now.
Awesome.
Best of luck.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Hope you enjoyed that conversation with Hank as much as I did. Next week, another local musician, Kevin Cohane, whose band Catnip has recently put out a couple of albums, and we'll talk about that. We also talk about Kevin's day job. He is the brand talent strategist over at Partners Creative, an advertising and communications agency here in town that I've collaborated with on a variety of dimensions. Excited to bring you my conversation with Kevin next week. Remember that A New Angle was brought to you by CED, Consolidated Electrical Distributors. By now, you've been listening long enough to know that these guys are big and that they sell pretty much everything electrical you would ever need. But you might not know that they hire a ton of University of Montana students. If you want to learn more about careers at CED, visit cedcareers.com. It's a great website name. Before we go, I want to thank some important peeps. Comzar, Elizabeth Willie, interns, Aspen Runkle, Mason Dow, and Max Gibson. Huge thanks to VTO for the tunes, and finally props to Jeff Meese, our master of all things sound. Before we go, if you have any questions, suggestions, comments, insults, whatever, please email me at anewangle@umontana.edu. Help us spread the word and be sure to use the hashtag #anewangle when you do. Thanks a lot. See you next time.